It began with a house, though calling the Wexford Estate merely a house was like calling a battlefield a clearing. It was a gigantic structure of Gothic stone and rotting magnificence, crouched on the northern edge of town like something that once breathed and had since forgotten how. Its windows were dark eyes, its balconies hunched shoulders, its walls a vault of silence thick enough to swallow entire years. No one in town spoke of it without lowering their voice. Children dared each other to touch the rusted iron gate, only to sprint back screaming. Adults avoided it entirely, muttering curses or prayers depending on whether they feared the house itself, or the stories buried inside it. The estate was older than the century, older than the tragedies stitched into its foundations. Its gardens were no longer gardens, but a jungle of ivy and dead hedges that clawed at anyone foolish enough to step inside. Its chimneys were black. Its doors were sealed. It was a place that seemed to remember. And then, after decades of stillness, someone disturbed it. A nearby university acquired the estate under the guise of architectural preservation. Funding came swiftly once scholars realized the building was a rare specimen of Victorian Gothic design. To them, it was not a haunted place. It was a blueprint of lost craftsmanship. They sent a team of graduate researchers, architects, historians, and one quiet young man whose silence was mistaken for humility. His name was Elias Wren. He was not the most outspoken among them, nor the most eager, but there was something in his eyes the house recognized. He had not come for academia. He had come because he was drawn to old things that refused to die. Their first week passed uneventfully. They documented beams, measured walls, and photographed carvings. The house tolerated them, at least at first. But the Wexford Estate did not exist to be studied. It existed to be found. Late one evening, while dust motes swirled like golden embers in the slanted dusk, Elias worked alone in the main hallway. He removed an oak panel near the staircase, something routine, something dull, until he pried too deep and too far. Behind the wood was not insulation. It was an empty cavity intentionally carved out. Something wrapped in cloth sat inside, coated in dust thick enough to become part of the object itself. Elias reached in, expecting tools or discarded decor, never expecting the weight he felt. He dragged it out. The cloth tore at his touch. A gilded wooden frame appeared, heavy, locked, sealed with tarnished brass, much older than the panel that hid it. The gold leaf clung to the edges like wounded skin. It wasn't merely hidden. It had been entombed. The students gathered, breath caught in their throats, unable to speak. But silence broke when one of them flipped the portrait over and saw what no restoration manual was prepared for. Carved roughly, desperately, into the back of the frame were words not meant for any stranger's eyes. Reginald, forgive me. Not written. Carved. Scratch. Beck. The house seemed to inhale. Dust settled. Wood moaned. Something shifted in the walls. Elias felt the air change, the same sensation one gets when a locked room realizes it is no longer alone. No one spoke for several seconds. The inscription was not mere curiosity, it was confession. Who was Reginald? Who begged him for forgiveness? What were they asking to be forgiven for? Elias didn't know yet. But the house did. And now it was awake. Why would someone bury a portrait and carve an apology into its back? What sin was so great the walls themselves had to hide it? History recorded Thomas Wexford as a visionary industrialist, a man whose ambition carved his name into the bones of commerce. But the people who lived near the estate whispered something different. Thomas didn't build the Wexford house to live in it. He built it to control everything inside it. In 1878 he stood at the very height of his power. His portrait, grand, imposing, and smug, still hung over the ballroom fireplace when Elias and the team entered it days later. The painted eyes seemed to follow them, judging every footstep. But Thomas Wexford was not alone in that portrait. To his right stood a strikingly beautiful woman. His second wife, Catherine Blackwell, whose pale blue eyes and gentle smile seemed too perfect to belong to someone mortal. Rumors had always clung to Catherine. Rumors of a past she didn't speak of, a fortune she didn't explain, a charm that never quite felt human. And then, oddly overshadowed, stood a young man, dark-haired, tall, barely touched by the painter's detail. His face was half in shadow, as though he wasn't supposed to be seen. His name, Elias discovered, was Reginald Wexford, Thomas's only son, born to his first wife Anne. The students studied the family records and a timeline emerged. 1878, Thomas marries Catherine. 1878, Reginald vanishes. No obituary. No travel record. No last sighting. He was simply erased. Elias, unlike the others, didn't see erasure, he saw intent. He noticed how Reginald's image in the family portrait looked almost resentful, as though he had been painted against his will. The painter's strokes in the background around him were rushed, almost angry. The estate had always been considered haunted, but not by ghosts, by questions. And Elias had just found one more. He searched deeper into archived letters and diaries stored in the estate's study. Dusty ink bottles sat beside brittle envelopes. One letter, unsigned yet unmistakably written by someone within the family, mentioned Reginald. He does not accept her. She fears he will expose something best left unspoken. They argue when I am not present. I fear for the peace of this house. Reginald is not safe. Something had been wrong even before the wedding night. Every entry after that turned darker. He refuses obedience. He speaks of truths no one should know. Catherine says he must be contained. Contained? Elias reread the phrase multiple times. It wasn't the kind of word parents used for rebellious sons. It was the language of captors. Then he found a final note, blotted with what looked like tears. If he stays, we will lose everything. If he leaves, we lose him. What am I to do? Thomas Wexford had been trapped between loyalty to his son and loyalty to a woman who had become the axis of his world. But history had already revealed the outcome. Catherine remained. Reginald vanished. The estate's silence now felt heavy, not empty but suffocating. Elias sensed that whatever happened to Reginald wasn't accidental, wasn't sudden, and wasn't a tragedy. It was a decision. One made inside these walls. Elias stared once more at the carved words on the back of the portrait. Reginald, forgive me. The message was no longer mysterious. It was guilt. Someone didn't hide the portrait out of fear. Someone hid it because the truth was still here, somewhere in this maze of rooms and shadows, waiting for anyone foolish or brave enough to look for it. Elias felt something shift behind him in the empty ballroom, like footsteps brushing over old wood. The air rippled with a cold breath. This wasn't just a missing person case. It was a confession wrapped inside a house that refused to forget. If Reginald never left the estate, then where did he go? Elias could no longer pretend this was merely academic research. Something inside the estate was guiding him, not kindly, not gently, but insistently, like a whisper pushing him toward a truth gasping beneath the floorboards. The north wing had always been avoided by the team. Not by rule but by instinct. The lights flickered there more than anywhere else, and even during the day the hallways felt darker than night. Every step Elias took seemed to echo twice, once beneath his feet and once behind him, as though someone walked in his shadow. Armed with a lantern and a map of the estate's original blueprint, he followed the penciled notes of whoever last documented the mansion. One section on the blueprint had been scratched out violently, as though someone wanted the space erased from existence. The handwriting near it read, "There is no room here." A lie so obvious it was practically an invitation. Elias pressed his ear against the marked wall. Something hollow responded. He knocked, once, twice, and the house answered back with a sound no abandoned structure should make. A muffled thud. Not wood. Not pipes. Something soft. Something that shouldn't still be making noise. Elias pried at the edge of the molding with a rusted chisel he had found in the study. Dust poured out. The wall groaned like it was being wounded. Finally, a slab of wood loosened and fell, revealing a pitch-black space behind it. A room with no windows, no light, and no way out except through the secret entrance Elias had just forced open. The lantern flickered violently, as if refusing to illuminate what came next. He stepped inside. The room was barely larger than a prison cell. The stone floor was uneven, clawed, and darkened by stains that time had tried, and failed, to forget. Iron shackles were bolted to the wall, their metal bitten by rust and something far older than decay. A bed frame, small, narrow, crouched against the corner. No mattress. No blankets. Just the skeletal remains of wood and rope. Someone had been kept here. Not for hours. Not for days. For long enough to leave marks. Elias lifted the lantern toward the far wall, and froze. Scratched into the stone, over and over, as though someone's nails had broken and bled and kept scratching anyway, was a single word. Remember. But beneath it lay something worse, a sentence carved deeper, the letters jagged and desperate. I am not mad. The lantern trembled in Elias's grip. His mouth went dry. He stepped back, only to kick something metallic. A small wooden box lay beneath the bed frame, sealed with a corroded latch. After several attempts, it snapped open. Inside were pages so brittle they nearly dissolved at his touch. The handwriting was frantic. Words slanted like the writer was racing against something closing in on him. Father believes her lies. She whispers poison. She says I know too much. She says I must be cured. I am not ill. If I disappear, remember, it was not my choice. The pages were signed. Reginald Wexford. Elias's breath hitched. The truth was no longer speculation. Reginald hadn't vanished. He had been hidden, contained, broken, buried alive inside his own home, while the world believed he sailed off freely into adulthood. A sudden gust of cold air surged through the small room, as though something had exhaled from the walls themselves. The lantern dimmed. Elias spun toward the opening, only to realize he wasn't alone. Behind him, pressed into the stone near the shackles, was the faint outline of a handprint, fresh, smeared in something dark, something that shouldn't exist after more than a century. Elias staggered backward, heart pounding. Reginald's warnings weren't historical records. They were instructions. Someone didn't want him remembered. Someone still didn't. If Reginald was kept here, then where did his body go? And who made sure no one ever found it? The discovery of the chamber gnawed at Elias like a wound that refused to clot. There was no more room for doubt. Reginald Wexford hadn't run away. He hadn't abandoned his home. He had been held, silenced, erased. But Elias still lacked the last and most monstrous piece of the puzzle. Where did Reginald end up? The answer, he realized, wouldn't be found in blueprints or hidden rooms. It would be found among the dead. On the farthest edge of the estate grounds stood a mausoleum, grand, imposing, its marble facade cracked like something beneath it struggled to escape. The structure was known in town not as a resting place but as a warning. People said the air grew colder near it. Animals refused to go close. Even the wind seemed to avoid that space. Elias approached with the lantern clutched tight. The doors were enormous slabs of iron and stone, engraved with the Wexford family crest. A wolf devouring its own tail. A symbol of legacy consuming itself. Fitting. Inside, dust lay thick as snowfall. The air tasted metallic as though time had curdled here. The tombs were arranged in neat rows, each name etched in elegant serif. Thomas Wexford, 1827 to 1891. Anne Wexford, 1834 to 1876. Catherine Wexford, dates chiseled away, erased. Elias paused. Catherine's stone was mutilated, clawed at, as though someone had tried, no needed, to remove her from history. But even that horror paled beside the final alcove. A plaque. A name. No dates. Reginald Wexford. No birth. No death. Just an accusation in marble. Elias ran trembling fingers across the stone. It felt wrong, not cold, not still, but humming. He pressed harder and something shifted. A faint click echoed through the mausoleum. The plaque slid aside like a door and a hidden recess yawned open beneath it. Inside lay a coffin, small, plain, nothing like the grand sarcophagi surrounding it. Elias braced himself and pushed the lid open. His breath hitched. Inside were bones, fragile and folded unnaturally, as though the body hadn't been laid to rest, but crammed into silence. Curled against the ribcage was a faded blue ribbon, the same shade Elias had seen in the hidden chamber. It had once belonged to a coat. Reginald's coat. Clutched in skeletal fingers was a locket. Against his better judgment, Elias opened it. On one side, a portrait of Reginald as a child, bright-eyed, alive. On the other, a woman's face and Wexford, his mother, not Catherine. A connection severed by death, preserved by desperation. But something else caught Elias's eye, scratched into the inside of the coffin lid, carved with the last of someone's strength. She won't let me sleep. Elias's pulse thundered. The mausoleum suddenly felt smaller, as if breathing around him. The lantern flickered. The shadows crawled. Reginald wasn't haunting the estate. He was trapped in it. The plea on the portrait wasn't forgiveness for abandonment, it was guilt for a punishment gone too far. Thomas had chosen Catherine over his son, believing her lies, following her whispers. Catherine hadn't merely hated Reginald. She had feared him. Feared what he knew. Feared what he could reveal. Feared that the house itself had chosen him. A brittle gust rushed past Elias, slamming the coffin lid shut so violently dust burst into the air. The lantern sputtered, struggling to stay lit. The silence around him felt alive, watching, listening, daring him to move. Slowly, Elias backed away from the coffin. He now understood the truth the estate had buried. Reginald didn't haunt the house. The house haunted Reginald. And if Catherine carved away her own history from the mausoleum, what had she left behind? What if Catherine's influence didn't end with death? What if she was still here, and waiting for anyone who dared remember him? Elias returned to the main hall with the weight of the estate pressing against his skull. Everything he'd uncovered pointed to the same impossible truth. Reginald had never escaped the Wexford Estate, because someone made sure he never could. His bones were imprisoned in the dark, but something else, something that refused to rot, remained. The portrait. It waited where they had first found it, propped against an unfinished restoration table. The other team members were gone for the night, leaving Elias alone with the object that had started this unraveling. The lantern flame danced against the varnished frame like a heartbeat, casting shadows across Reginald's painted face. But something was different. Reginald's eyes, which earlier seemed dull and distant beneath cracked oil, now held a sharpness, as if awareness had seeped back into them. It wasn't trick of the light. Elias felt watched, judged, recognized. He examined the frame again. The gilded wood trembled under his fingers, and the carved words, "Reginald, forgive me," felt warmer, as though guilt had a pulse. He exhaled shakily and lifted the latch that sealed the painting. Rusted metal groaned, resisting, then relented. The portrait opened like a door to something that had never meant to be disturbed. Inside the backing was another layer of canvas, a hidden section the restoration notes never mentioned. Elias peeled it back. A message sprawled across the cloth in slanted handwriting. "The truth has a witness." Not a statement. A warning. Below the words was a painted image, a shadowed figure standing behind Reginald, blurred yet chillingly recognizable even without full detail. Catherine's silhouette hovered like a stain across the younger man's life, her hand not resting on his shoulder but gripping it, fingers digging in like talons. Catherine wasn't a memory. She was a possession. Suddenly the lantern flickered out. Darkness suffocated the hall. The temperature plunged. Elias's breath curled in the air, and a sound, faint yet unmistakable, crawled out of the walls. Knock. Pause. Knock. Closer. Elias froze, pulse pounding. Knock. Right beside him. He forced the lantern back to life. The flame sputtered, and revealed something horrifying. Reginald's painted hand was no longer by his side. It was pressed flat against the inside of the canvas, as though he was pushing to get out. Elias stumbled back, knocking over tools. His mind tried to rationalize, but his body already understood. Reginald hadn't asked for forgiveness. He asked to be released. Every whisper, every carved warning, every plea etched in stone and canvas, they weren't echoes of regret. They were instructions. Catherine hadn't tried to silence a troublesome son. She had bound something she couldn't destroy. A presence. The truth. A voice the house could not bear to let go. Elias backed toward the exit, but the hall stretched longer than before, as though the estate itself was changing, rearranging, closing. Behind him, the portrait creaked open further. A whisper slithered up his spine, a voice older than death, dripping with the agony of a century. "Remember me." The lantern went out a second time. This time it did not return. Somewhere in the blackness, a door slammed shut. Not the portraits. The houses. And Elias understood, too late, the final horror. The Wexford Estate was never haunted because someone died inside it. It was haunted because someone was still here. Now that Elias has remembered him, who will remember Elias?